Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections since we are recording it for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. You're welcome to post questions and comments during the session, and we'll try to answer them online. I'd like to introduce our moderator, John Gilroy, host of Federal Tech Talk on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Brett McMillan, Director, Federal Government, Amazon Web Services, and Keith Johnson, Chief Technology Officer and Chief Engineer, Defense and Intelligence Group at Leidos. Today we're going to talk about delivering on the promise of the cloud. And boy, I've been studying up on this interview, and I talked to a guy named Steve Bennett. He's got a PhD from Stanford, so you know he's got to be smart. Not only that, he gets PhD in computational biochemistry. He does a lot of big data. And the last time I talked to him, he said that in a few years, there'll be 163 zettabytes of data out there. I mean, this is almost unimaginable. So the question for you gentlemen, and I'll start off maybe with Keith here, is so how can agencies cope with this? Should they just quit their job and run away? Or how do you cope with all these zettabytes?
Well, the key is how do you best leverage that data through analytics? Because clearly, we're not scaling the number of humans to the size and the scale of the data to deal with zettabytes. So the key is how do I smartly apply data analytics, smartly store that data, and then apply analytics in order to get value out of it, basically pushing up to the human decision makers the best kinds of information for them to look at. So it's about leveraging the data through analytics and through better, more efficient storage mechanisms, which is really where the cloud comes in, which I think I'll defer to my august colleague here.
So how do they juggle everything?
Yeah,
Brett.
so it's not just how do you cope with the amount of data, because the federal government's been really good for a very long time at collecting data. The question is, how do you make that data usable? And how do you make it usable not only for the agency that collected it, but throughout the agencies of the federal government? And then most of the data that the citizens have already paid for, they don't need to pay for again. So it should be available to commercial entities, to citizens. And so what we've been doing is we've been working with these agencies to do analytics, as was mentioned, but also just making that data available so that organizations can build on top of it.
So I'm going to throw another fun fact at you. So can you handle it?
Okay.
The fun fact is that all these zettabytes of information, the single larger producer of this data in the world is going to be the federal government. That's even another curveball at you. So what about the increasing scale too?
Well, it's really all comes around. Data is the lifeblood and the currency of the future innovation and really the future marketplace that we're going to live in. So, federal government plays a really important role, not just in generating data, but also policy-wise and how best to secure and store that data, and so that only the right kinds of individuals can access that. The federal government has a unique role, and their job is to lead the way in how to do this securely. We're working across our customer, our federal government customer, to help them figure out best ways to store securely and then analyze that data. So it could be citizen services, health, national security, transportation. There's many aspects to this, and data comes in many different formats. It could come in just personal information, like data around a person, date of birth, passport information, but also we're generating lots more data on using sensor types like Internet of Things and areas like traffic cameras, things like satellite imagery, and then medical data, generating data around healthcare, and then things like cancer research. All sorts of data, different types, and the key is how do you bring this together securely to bring insights that will allow us as just citizens to live better, more productive lives, and also at the same way innovate in a way that allows the commercial industry to leverage these for betterment of our nation, our world.
You know, about years ago, when I wanted a bigger hard drive, both you and I would probably drive down to Micro Center, get a bigger hard drive, and put it on our machine. It's great. Well, things have changed a little bit, And so with the sudden increase in data, maybe that's the motivator to look at enterprise cloud procurements, isn't it? I mean, that you can't go back and forth to the Seagate store too many times. You have to look at it from an enterprise perspective, don't you?
Sure. Yeah. And so the enterprise solution is something that these agencies are moving forward with. And it's being driven not only by the large data sets, but also the usability of these data sets and pulling them together in ways that we can better serve the citizens. Let me give you a specific example of that. Over at the Medicaid program, for example. Now, Medicaid and CHIP, the Child Health Insurance Program, these are for the people in most need of health care coverage. Think about foster children. Think about those single poverty level mothers. And so Medicaid gives money to the state and local governments. And they're doing a great job of providing that data. But when you start asking questions like, is the right poverty level child or poverty level young mother getting the right prenatal care that they need? Those questions are kind of hard to ask because the money goes out from CMS. But then you have 50 states that have the data in different formats, and plus all the territories. So the cloud allows all these organizations to normalize that data, bring it back, and then what you can do is you can look across the spectrum and say, in this zip code, are the right poverty level mothers getting the right care that they have? And when you start doing analytics against that, you're starting to serve the citizens a lot better than you could in the past. And these are things that the cloud's bringing, and it's providing a promise or a way of solving problems that in the past was really hard for them to do without the cloud.
And just on that note, on the cloud, what we're transitioning from when you mentioned going and purchasing more hard drives is we're moving from a IT storage compute as a enterprise resource to a shared resource. And we actually are then transforming from a kind of a poverty mindset to a wealth mindset when it comes to compute and store. No longer do I need to think of compute and store as a scarce resource, and so then I can only do certain things with that information. Now what I'm able to do is go through a lot more experimental activities to determine what if analysis. Like what if, how do I know that I'm getting giving the best prenatal care is a question now that I can answer and explore in a lot more details because of that I don't need to go and procure another hard drive. And so moving from scarcity to abundance, and then moving from a ownership to a rental model is another, I think, a key aspect that we can talk about that as well later. Yeah. But the idea is I don't have to own it, so I don't have to pay for it all the time. I can only pay for it when I use it. And so it's more tied to outcomes than it was in the past.
Brett, you mentioned 50 states before. I think the people in this town think about the 135 agencies. So what about, can a move to the cloud impact more than just one agency at a time?
Sure. And we see that in multiple areas. We were talking about data sets earlier. And it's very common when a single agency generates a data set, it's usable for multiple different agencies. So, for example, pick any of the data sets out there. A very large data set is a Landsat data set. And so this is the pictures of the Earth that has been taken from space. And these files come down, and there are these big, unwieldy files that come out. And you can imagine all the agencies of the federal government that need to utilize these. So it's USDA, it's Forest Service, it's Bureau of Land Management. But beyond that, it is state municipalities. It's all these companies that want to build something on it. So we've worked with the Landsat data to take that Landsat data and break it down into manageable chunks. And then build these standard RESTful APIs so that other organizations can build things, and it can be a simple API call to now ask the question, has this little section of land, this half an acre of land, how has it changed in the last year, decade, 2 decades? And by taking that data that is owned by the taxpayer but managed by Department of Interior and making it as this public data set, now we have multiple government agencies being able to do really rich things for the citizens with that data set.
Keith, we just heard the word standard, RESTful API, and there's people who listen who know exactly what that is. I want to just one word, standard. Yeah. And so when it comes to this low-cost compute and store, Are there standard operating procedures or governance policy that'll enable this interagency, procurement?
We talked about APIs and RESTful interfaces. With that are what we're calling microservice-based architectures, breaking up the data and the applications in order to be to scale and to better access the information. So from a technical architectural perspective, yes, there are standards around how you do that. And we're really taking our cues from the large, we'll call them internet-based companies that have addressed this and proven out these architectures. From a governance perspective, there are certainly security standards that need to apply. For instance, one additional way that we're now working with our customers is by standardizing security policies. And with the cloud and other kind of broad layered approaches to architecting, we're able to leverage security accreditations, inherit that as we move up the stack. And so standard approaches, not just with architectural, but with security policy, with how I deal with privacy data, and then ultimately, how do I transfer from measuring operational impacts to measuring outcomes?
So, Brett, it seems like the magic sauce has got something to do with metadata, taxonomy, being able to scale between agencies, and it's right exactly in your strike zone.
Yep, absolutely. And you're following up on the discussion we're having about standards. One of the things that happens is when an agency or a group of agencies agree on a standard way to deploying things on the cloud, what happens is that more organizations can do more now in the cloud than they could in the past. Because up until the last several years, what was happening was federal agencies were picking a particular program that had a particular challenge and saying, the cloud can help this. And yet, what should happen in all these agencies is any program that could benefit from the cloud should be able to quickly and easily take advantage of that new technology. And by setting up these standards that are enterprise-wide or agency-wide, now each program area can say, I can benefit my program. And it's no longer just the programs that have a bright spotlight on it. And by having a wider utilization of the cloud or wider ability for organizations to work in the cloud, we're seeing new systems and new innovations come up in some areas where you never thought that would happen in the past.
And just piggyback on that, Brett, is the idea that instead of taking the mindset of moving one application to the cloud at a time, what we're advocating as a system integrator is a portfolio of applications, because that's where you really achieve the efficiencies and also unlock the data, because you're really needing to re-architect that set of applications that then leads to better scaling, and then also re-architecting, like we talked about, the application interface, and then we can extend that across not just that agency, but across agencies.
Yeah.
And Leidos is doing a great job of not only doing that, but also once you move these groups of applications into the cloud, you now have tools that you never had before for greater collaboration, and you're starting to see some cross-functional things happen in program areas that never really happened before because now they're on a common platform. Yeah.
It seems like what a combination of Amazon Web Services and Leidos, you can be the true silo smashers. You know the word from that company? I mean, it's like it's putting it in work boots. It's okay, it's been the ceiling hard to break, but it's almost a structural way, And I've had enterprise architects show me diagrams of enterprise, and it just puts me right to sleep. It's much more a dynamic. It's almost a whiteboard instead of a printed piece of paper. It's like, okay, and this is how dynamic and flexible you have to be. It's not certain assumptions. You have to just flex with new things that come in the market daily.
Mm-hmm. One innovation that Amazon provided was little icons for architectures. And it's simple, but when you have a standard iconography for describing storage and compute, it really helps bridge those gaps, because every architect likes to use their one approach, but when you're forced to use a standard set of
there's the word everyone's afraid
icons,
of.
right? Yeah. Then you start to see, what I was doing was very similar to what this person over here was doing, and I can then leverage best practices a lot easier.
Yeah, I want to talk about your father's Oldsmobile, but your father's Oldsmobile was a laminated 11 by 17 piece of paper and 8-point type. You remember those?
Right.
And going, people just never use them except the guy who wrote it. You know, it's you have to liberate the data, or maybe data is the new killer app. It's the data itself.
And so when you're talking about standards, and we were talking earlier about procurement and acquisitions, one of the great things that we're finding is that when you set up these acquisitions correctly, then as new technologies are coming out, you can actually morph these systems into the latest and greatest technologies without having to rewrite an RFP. One of the challenges that happen throughout the federal government is that you have companies performing against a set of requirements that are fixed and were written a long time ago. And we're seeing more and more of these acquisitions being set up in such a way that these systems can respond to whatever changes are happening, the changes required by the public, the changes required by the administration or Capitol Hill. And and what's happening in the cloud is we're constantly coming out with new products and services that can do things in different ways, whether it be artificial intelligence or machine learning or the managed databases or whatever. And so what will happen is we're able to set up these procurements, or the government's able to set up these procurements. So now these systems are not static as they used to be, and they can constantly innovate.
Instead of being physically modular, it has to be intellectually modular, doesn't it?
It does, right? And that's where the partnership between Leidos and Amazon comes in. The standardization approach that Amazon brings, coupled with the system integrator who really is looking at the mission for our customers and then how to fit that mission into the standard approach that Amazon provides, it's a good fit. And so what we're trying to advocate is it's about the cloud, but it's also about how we leverage that cloud smartly. And that requires some nuance around how to fit the mission applications in.
I'm your moderator, John Gilroy, on the panel discussion, Delivering on the Promise of the Cloud, sponsored by Leidos and Amazon Web Services on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.